Hey guys, this is Jason from Sunrise, and this is the Gusto plus Sunrise payroll feature demonstration. Welcome to the wild world of payroll. So, we are starting from our Sunrise dashboard here, and I have just created a fresh Sunrise user, and along with that Sunrise user, I have created a fresh Sunrise organization to go along with that user, and it's called Sunrise plus Gusto. So, all of that to say, this is a fresh account, so all of the data is only going to reflect what we do here with our payroll feature. So, the way to navigate to payroll is in our main navigation here. It's in the expenses group. You just click payroll and you are met by this screen. This is our Sunrise plus Gusto landing page. It says make payroll easy, powered by Gusto. And on this page, there are two call to action buttons. Well, there's one create a Gusto account button here. And then there's another CTA, this link, connect to Gusto. So if you are a Sunrise user, but you've never used Gusto before and you're interested and you want to create an account, you would click the button. Or if you're a Sunrise user and you already have a Gusto account, you would click connect. So if we click this create a Gusto account button, this is our provisions endpoint. And so we'll click create. It's going to take us to this Gusto website. And essentially what we've done is give the user a little bit of a head start when creating their Gusto account. We sent over their username, their email address, their phone number, and their organization name. And with this provisions endpoint, Gusto is going to use that information to create an account for them. So we'll click create with email, but we won't set up our accounts because I want to use the test data that we have. And also, I'm on our Sunrise staging site, and so this email is not valid, and I wouldn't have an address to go actually retrieve this confirmation email that they're about to send. So here it says confirm your account. We're going to skip that. We're just going to navigate back to Sunrise, and you will notice that this Sunrise Gusto landing page, the image has changed to this lounging gentleman, and it says finish your setup. That's the only CTA we have available now. And so we'll go ahead and click that, and that will bring us the OAuth screen where we can give Sunrise access to our newly created Gusto account. However, I'm already logged into my demo account, and so that's why I didn't have to enter in an email or a password. And so it's actually showing me the second screen of this OAuth window, and that is to select any and all of the companies that I have associated with this Gusto account. Um, so I could, if I wanted to, uncheck this company called Empty Company, and then authorize, and then my Sunrise account would only have access to this Sunrise with Gusto company. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to select them both. But actually, before we even do that, let's close the OAuth window for a second. So we have not authenticated yet. We haven't given Sunrise access to our Gusto account. But theoretically, we finished our Gusto setup and it does exist. So um, if we navigated away from Sunrise and came back to it another day and decided that we want to come to payroll, we forgot somehow that we'd already created a Gusto account. If we did click this again, we'll see, let me close my nav, we'll see that, or my console, that we got an error, and it informs the user that they've already created a Gusto account and that they should try to log into their Gusto account with the credentials that they used to create it. So we'll go ahead and do that. And now we're going to authorize. So now we're giving Gusto, or Sunrise rather, authorization into our Gusto account. And now we are in our Sunrise setup process for connecting our Gusto account to our Sunrise organization. So step one is to select a Gusto account. So we're asking them to select either Sunrise with Gusto in this case, or Empty Company. In the case of this Gusto user, to connect to this organization that I've created called Sunrise plus Gusto. So for each, it's a one-to-one mapping for a Sunrise organization and a Gusto company. So if we switch to a second organization within our Sunrise account, we could map that second organization to the same Gusto company if we chose to, for whatever reason. Anyway, let's go ahead and just select one of these. So I'm going to select Sunrise with Gusto first, and then we'll disconnect the account, and I'll show you what happens when you use a newly created account that doesn't have any payroll data. But for the demo, let's go ahead and select this company that I have, Sunrise with Gusto, because that's the one that has all the sample data, and then we can see a bunch of other components and screens. So we'll click Continue, and step 2 of our setup is an account mapping window. So this basically is on the left of this table, we have Gusto categories. So there's net pay, commissions, owner's draw, reimbursements, employer taxes, employer benefit contributions, and a corrections category that they are going to be mapping to. On the right-hand side, there is all of the chart of accounts that these potential categories are going to be charted to. That might make a little more sense as we get into this. So essentially what we're saying is we're going to create some expenses in your Sunrise account, some journal entries, some transactions using these categories. And on the right, where you see the Sunrise account listed, these are pre-populated accounts that we have selected for the user. So essentially we are guiding them through this process, giving them our recommendations, and also initially notifying them where these categories of expenses will be charted to. If they have a good sense that they want to change or alter our suggestions, they can go ahead and click Edit, and then the selections become drop-down selectors, and then they can select either from a list of their pre-existing expense accounts. We've also included in that list some equity accounts and liability accounts, or they can create a brand new expense account by the name of the category that we're charting to. For the purposes of this demonstration, we'll just go ahead and stick with our suggestions for now, and later I'll show you how we can edit those at another time. So we'll just go ahead and click Finish, and that's basically it for setting up our Gusto account and integrating it in with our Sunrise organization. So because this is a Gusto account that does have past payroll data, we're going to be met by this view, which is a table of all of the payrolls that are available to import into your Sunrise organization. So the reason why we haven't automatically imported these payrolls is because we're going to base it off of the assumption that if you are a current Gusto user and you've been using Gusto payroll, you have potentially, or maybe even probably, already accounted for your past payrolls, and so there'd be no need for you to import them because you've already accounted for them. But if you haven't, or maybe you missed one, or maybe you want to start from scratch, you can import to your heart's delight. And so we'll just click Import here and import our first payroll, and you'll see instantly the dashboard populates with some numbers. And the dashboard right now, all the data up here is only representative of this one payroll because we've only imported one payroll, but we can see how that changes in a second. So let's take a deeper look at what happens behind the scenes once we've imported a payroll. If we go to our expenses here in Sunrise, and remember this was a fresh organization, so what I'm looking at right now is all three of these expenses that are listed on this table are just a result of that single payroll that we imported. So importing that particular payroll created three expenses. There's a Gusto benefits expense, there's a Gusto net pay expense, and a Gusto taxes expense. So for that particular payroll, we only created three expenses. there is a potential for two other expenses to be created for a payroll, depending on what kind of data is in the payroll. Um, One that is not listed here would be a garnishments expense, and it would only be applicable to a child support uh, expense amount that would have come out of that payroll. And the reason why we would have that separate expense card is because it would be handled as a separate bank transaction. So the user would see a garnishment debit from their bank account for the amount of that child support. And so we're going to create an expense card for that. And the fifth potential would be some kind of reimbursement expense that would also show up as a debit. And so we would want to create a separate expense card for that as well. So let's take a deeper look into one of these expense cards. So we'll start with net pay because that's one of the big ones. So this net pay amount here is going to either equal the debit from Gusto for the direct deposits for this payroll. And if there are any individual checks that were also written, this number would match the sum of the direct deposit debit plus all of those net pay checks that were paid out would add up to this amount. And so that's what this expense represents. And notice that it is all mapped to a single account. And our recommended account is salaries and wages. And that's going to come into play with some of these other expenses that we've created. So the net pay of the payroll, all of it goes into salaries and wages, at least initially. So if we go back to expenses, let's go to our taxes. And here, there will be a tax transaction, so a user can expect to see a tax debit from Gusto. The total debit will be this amount, 94.80, and we're breaking it down into two expense lines. One, we're taking the employee taxes, and we're taking that amount and we're mapping that amount also to salaries and wages, or whatever the user has eventually map their net pay category to. We're going to put the employee taxes into that account as well. The employer taxes are handled differently, and so we'll put those in business licenses and taxes. This is the recommended account. But for this expense, remember, we've also put in those payroll taxes into salaries and wages for the employees. So if you imagine we have the net pay, which essentially is their gross minus taxes, and we're also putting the employee taxes in there as well. If we look at expenses one more time, we're going to look at benefits. And you'll notice a trend here. The employee benefit deductions, we are automatically mapping to that net pay category. And in our case, again, it's salaries and wages. And then for the employer contributions, that's going to go into a different chart of accounts. And so we're sort of taking these expenses and the debits that they're going to be expected to see in their bank, and then we're properly mapping them to the appropriate account. Just a note on benefits. This debit that a user will be expected to see is a third-party debit. It won't be coming from Gusto. And usually benefits are handled on a monthly cycle, and payroll is going to be weekly, biweekly, monthly. There can be off cycles as well. And so for each payroll, there will be a separate payroll expense made, and then the aggregate of that month's benefits will add up to the aggregate of the benefits expenses for however many payrolls were run that month. And then in addition to that, if we go to transactions, we can see the three expenses that we just went through, and we can see a fourth transaction, and this is a journal entry that was made for this payroll. So if we get into that, let me zoom up on that for a second. You can see that we have credited salaries and wages, and if you remember, that's where we put all of our gross pay essentially to the employee. We're crediting the owner's draw portion to that account, and we're going to debit that owner's draw from whichever account they had charted to the owner's draw category. And so what that's done is allowed for the expense to exist so they can match it properly with their expected uh, debit, their net pay debit. But then once we've handled the trend or the debit itself and the expense itself, we can then rechart these funds into the appropriate account, which is owner's draw. And there's one other time that this is going to happen with a journal entry, is that we would take from salaries and wages the amount for commissions and tips, and it would be a journal entry, and we'd put that into a different category as well. And so that is under the hood of a payroll import and what is happening on the bookkeeping side. And so let's import a couple more payrolls just so that we can get a sense of what's going on up top there. And I'm going to import, let's let these run for a second. And if you notice, we've only got 2020 available in our list of fiscal years here. And so this is this 184 plus number. This is an aggregate of all of the payrolls that have been run for 2020 or imported rather into Sunrise for 2020. And then if we were to import a payroll from 2019, it'll be available for us in the 2019 year that is now available to us. And you can see it's just reflecting the single payroll because we only have one payroll from 2019. If we go to the account mapping tab, this is where a user can check out where they've mapped their different categories to what accounts in Sunrise. So it's an overview. You'll notice from our expenses, we are not listing employee taxes. We are not listing employee benefit deductions. And we are not listing that child support garnishment, because essentially those are all really a part of net pay. And so wherever they chart their net pay category to, whatever account that's going to be, behind under the hood, we are automating that for them for those three potential expense lines. So they won't be able to divorce those assignments from net pay. It could be something that somebody notices and maybe they want to just take a look and they don't see that it's listed here. And we've taken it away because it shouldn't be separated from net pay. And so we won't allow, we're helping them not make the mistake. So if we want to change our mappings, we can go to edit and we can change any of these mappings here. So we can change our net pay from salaries and wages. If we just wanted to get crazy, we'll just put it in advertising and marketing. I don't know why they would do that, but if they wanted to, we are not going to stop them. And you'll see that net pay is now reflecting Sunrise. Sunrise's advertising and marketing account. One edge case with account mapping is if a user decides to delete or archive one of these accounts that they have mapped one of these Gusto categories to. In that event, if we didn't handle it, when they try to import one of these payrolls, it would fail because we wouldn't have an account to use to map the expense to. So let's just take a look at what would happen. So if we go to our chart of accounts, and here, I know that this account, this expense account, employee reimbursements, we are using right now for our reimbursements mapping. So let's just go ahead and delete it. And then when we navigate back to payroll, yeah, we see this error state. And in the tabs here, the account mapping tab is red with a flag. And then even the import buttons are changed from blue to red. So if we go to the tab, the account mapping tab, it'll show us the account that is missing and the one that needs to be addressed. And they can just click edits and a little more detailed messaging in the error there. And it will show the account and where to remap it. So if we cancel that and let's say that the user tries to import it. They're throwing caution to the wind, and they click import here. We're going to pop up this remap modal once again and force them to remap that account before we allow them to import uh, another payroll. So let's go ahead and recreate that account. Click finish. It's going to refresh for them. And now we are back in business once again. So that is the importing of payrolls. We've gone through the data here. There are some buttons up in our header. One is run payroll. And what that really is just a deep link into the Gusto page for them to run their payroll. Um, and we have a couple more deep links here. There's one for account settings, and clicking account settings is going to bring them to their Gusto settings page. And there's one for our help article on Gusto as well, so they can click learn more, and it'll take them to a help article. And also in this dropdown, there is a re-authenticate link and a disconnect link. So for re-authenticate, one thing that we should do is sort of explore what happens if for some reason the access tokens get out of sync with one of our users. I want to show you the error state and how to proceed there. So we will, I'm going to go into my database and just make my auth token invalid for this user. So just bear with me for a second here while I do a little work off screen. And I'm going to try to make a request just by syncing. So I'll just click this sync button here. And all that's going to do is send a request to try to pull in these Gusto payrolls. If there's nothing new, nothing's going to change, but it is a request. And so if I'm not authenticated, I shouldn't be able to make that request. So we'll go ahead and sync. And it says, uh-oh, something went wrong. You're not authorized. Your authentication may be invalid or expired. Try to re-authenticate. So if in the event that a user's account becomes out of sync and unauthenticated, they can go ahead and click this and they can re-authenticate their account. I just want to mention also that from this auth screen, they also can select, in the beginning, had we not selected empty company and we had only authorized our user to have access to one of these companies, and later they wanted to change that selection, this would be the place to do it. Anyway, we can click authorize. We're going to exchange our stale, or in this case, I altered that, that auth token. So it says reauthentication of your Gusto account was successful. Cool. And so now I can expect that if I try to refresh this, I shouldn't get that error again. Cool. And it worked out for us. If for some reason we were troubleshooting and the user had an issue with authentication, that for some reason we hadn't caught the error and we hadn't handled it in the way that that error had popped up previously with the reauth link included in it, we can always go to more, and that's where this reauthenticate link comes into play. We can reauthenticate at any point and we can exchange our tokens. I'm not going to do it again, but it's the same process. And then there's one other link to kind of display here, and it is this disconnect. So if for whatever reason a user was unhappy with their integration, or they just wanted to start fresh, or they accidentally connected the wrong Gusto company with the wrong Sunrise organization, we can go ahead and disconnect that connection. So they would click disconnect. It's going to give them a confirmation modal that pops up because they are going to lose all of this aggregated data that we have up in the data table. Just to be clear, it does not alter any data on the Gusto side. So all of the payroll data is still pristine. It doesn't affect that in any way, shape, or form. And what this disconnect also will not do is erase any expenses or journal entries that were created from previously imported payrolls. This is just going to disconnect the Gusto company from your Sunrise organization, and so that you can reconnect a different organization. It's basically wiping the slate clean for your Sunrise organization in terms of this view only, not the expenses that may or may not have been created in the past. So we'll click disconnect, and now we're at this screen. Um, so we could, if for some reason you wanted to disconnect and then immediately reconnect an account, you could go ahead and click Finish Gusto Setup. But if we refresh this page and imagine that we've navigated here months later and had a change of heart and wanted to give it a go with Gusto one more time, we're going to go through the whole setup process again. So this time, instead of selecting Sunrise with Gusto, the company that has payroll data, I'm going to go ahead and select this empty one. Go ahead and select continue. And then again, it's the same process. Here's our recommended accounts. Again, we can change them if we need to, but we're not going to. We're just going to click finish. It's going to try to pull some payrolls, and it's going to realize that there are no payrolls to be pulled because this company has not run a payroll yet. They haven't processed a payroll in Gusto yet. And so then the link here will lead them. This is another deep link. It's the same deep link as this run payroll button back to Gusto, and to run the payroll that may be available to them, or until there is a payroll to be imported. This will be the screen that they're met with. And that is basically it for the functionality of the Sunrise payroll integration.